everyone, my name is Merav. Where is Amitai? And here is Amitai. And we're from the threat research team at Wiz. And today we're going to talk a bit about the connection between CloudSec and AppSec. We'll go through a few recent vulnerabilities and their impact on cloud environments, as well as share our insights about vulnerability management and vulnerability intelligence in the cloud. A few caveats before that. We base our research on our data, and our customers are large organizations that have other CNAPS tools, and we don't detect every single vulnerability in technology. So that's worth mentioning. And also keep in mind that this data is not based on runtime checks. But yeah, let's start. We'll start with the good guys, and that's the fun part about vulnerability management in cloud. So the cloud brings a lot of new opportunities to vulnerability management. Like you can reduce attack surface with smaller images, and also SaaS and serverless. Have faster patch cycles. And also a cool thing that some third-party vulnerabilities are not as impactful for cloud as they are on on-prem. And we'll elaborate about that a little bit in a little bit. However, some vulnerabilities are more impactful in the cloud. And despite serverless and SaaS being fun, their appliance counterparts could be more difficult because you rely on vendors for patches and the visibility could be tricky. We have a lot of tools that provide us with all the vulnerabilities that we have in our environments, but it's really hard to know which ones matter and how to prioritize them. There's a ton of CVEs, like hundreds of thousands of CVEs, and some of them matter and some of them don't. And where do we start with that? We need to think about the kind of technologies that are prevalent in the cloud and what kind of attack surface they provide to attackers. And what kind of vulnerabilities are useful to threat actors that are targeting the cloud. Okay, so the cloud is made of some components that we're all familiar with, for example, servers, EC2s, load balancers, but there are some things that we don't expect to see in the cloud, for example, routers or phones. So if I see a critical vulnerability in Android, I don't care. I mean, I do care because I have one and I will patch it, but for my cloud, it doesn't matter. When you think about operating systems, you might think, oh, it's Linux. That's the number one. And that would be mostly true. I mean, in AWS, you can see 92% of instances run Linux. But when it comes to Azure, it goes to a different situation. That's 50-50. That's a very different kind of percentage. And while, yes, Linux would be our number one priority when it comes to operating system vulnerabilities, we should still not neglect Windows. Okay, so here we have a huge graph, which I assume people in the back don't really see that well, so I'll explain as best as I can. That's the top 500 technologies that we see in cloud environments by prevalence. So the x-axis is the percent of cloud environments that have those kind of technologies, and the y-axis is the number of instances that are running those technologies. And you can see in the top right corner a lot of technologies that are common in pretty much everything. For example, coding languages or operating systems. And you might look at the bottom left, and I assume not everyone sees that, but you can see some technologies that you assume would be common, like everyone uses them, for example, Confluence or GitHub servers, but they're in the bottom left, so they're not that common. And that would be because a lot of customers prefer to use the SaaS versions of those technologies. So which of these technologies actually expose attack surface in the cloud? Or more right is like what doesn't expose attack surface. There are a lot of cool vulnerabilities in Outlook and Office that get a lot of traction online, but they usually require some sort of user interaction. And generally speaking, servers don't click on things, so they wouldn't fall for phishing, for example. But you know, other non-user interaction vulnerabilities would be more interesting to us. Some of you may have encountered Vim vulnerabilities in like really high CVSS scores, and you probably thought, oh, that's scary, or maybe you didn't. But Vim would probably never be publicly exposed in the cloud, so no attacker could be able to exploit that kind of vulnerabilities, and frankly, we don't really care about it either. So we put those type of vulnerabilities in technologies on this spectrum. On your right, yes, you have the most cloudy vulnerabilities, and on the left side, you've got the least cloudy vulnerabilities. What I mean by that, you can see some vulnerabilities in IoT devices or hardware like routers and stuff. And on the right side, you can see vulnerabilities in cloud services and middlewares. And let's zoom in on that for a second. From our data, we can tell that 90% of environments have publicly exposed container hosts with container escape vulnerabilities. That's a huge attack surface in the cloud. And also, double that amount have publicly exposed resources with vulnerabilities in CSP-supplied software. For example, middlewares like OMI. So those are very significant numbers there. That leads us to the first part of our key questions when prioritizing vulnerabilities. We need to think about the value of the technology that is vulnerable. How prevalent it is, as we showed before in the graph. Does it contain sensitive data, or does it inherently need high privileges in the cloud? After talking about the technologies that matter, let's talk about the actual type of vulnerabilities that we care about. And that would be anything that helps an attacker achieve their goals. Their goals like stealing sensitive data, hijacking workloads and resources, impersonating workloads, stealing credentials. All of that would be the attacks that we are most afraid of. Thinking about those goals, other vulnerabilities become less significant. For example, if an attacker wants to move laterally in the cloud, then they wouldn't necessarily need local privilege escalation because they can use the credentials from like environment variable, sorry, and also IMDS. And sometimes even RCE, which is like RCE is not really necessary. If an attacker wants to steal data, for example, for ransomware, they can just settle for an information disclosure vulnerability, and that would be enough for them. So container escape vulnerabilities are important, they're common as we saw, but they're not always necessary. And we try to put that on a diagram. So obviously RCE is king. You can get anything you want from that, but you can also settle for a lot less. Either SSRF or information disclosure could be very helpful for attackers. But when do container escapes and local privilege escalation matter to us? That would be in multi-tenant architectures. If a threat actor is targeting a multi-tenant architecture, they already are post-authentication, and they need to think about how they're getting from that node to other tenant nodes or something like that, and that they need to be admin on that container host or whatever machine they're on. And that's where they need container escape or local privilege escalation. And that brings us to the second part of our key questions for prioritization, and that will be the initial access potential. Does it allow RCE? Does it allow access to sensitive data? And are there any conditions that the attacker needs to have before that, for example, pre-authentication, to exploit that vulnerability? And I'll pass the mic over to Amitai now.
Thank you. So let's try to put some of what Merav spoke about from theory into practice and try to understand how we can actually map the network attack surface of the cloud. Look at the big picture and talk about what should concern the atypical cloud customer when it comes to vulnerabilities. So we can try to model this, taking the two key questions we spoke about before, about tech value and initial access potential, and sort of spread another spectrum of the types of vulnerabilities we should be concerned about. So of least concern would be, for example, obviously, a router denial of service, because as we mentioned, routers don't really run in the cloud. Another example, maybe less obvious, would be a one-click RCE in Firefox, something that requires some sort of user interaction, because again, servers don't generally click on things unless they're very, very creative crawlers. And on the top right, those of most concern would be in technologies that are very prevalent in the cloud, that often have very high privileges, that often contain very sensitive data, and also allow initial access potential, just by the nature of their type of vulnerability. And these are the areas where we should be focusing most of our attention. So let's try to take the 200 and something thousand vulnerabilities that we started with, check where they exist in our cloud environments, and try to triage them and understand what we can do to make this number a lot smaller. So we'll go down a funnel diagram. We'll start with all our vulnerable workloads in our environment. The next thing we can do is use a bunch of CVSS metrics that correspond to the initial access potential we spoke about before. We want to focus on stuff that has very high severity, obviously. We want to check stuff that has a network attack vector. So stuff that is only locally exploitable wouldn't be as much concern as something that is exploitable over the internet. We want stuff that has minimum user interaction. We want stuff that doesn't require any prior privileges. Obviously, in some cases, this will be exploitable, but in most cases, it won't. And we want something that has either an integrity or a confidentiality impact, because otherwise it's likely to be a denial of service vulnerability and not an RCE or an information disclosure. So that's like the dry CVSS data. That's our starting point. The next becomes a bit more difficult. Here we have to use vulnerability intelligence to help us understand what really matters. So what we do on our team is we look at a bunch of different sources for what vulnerabilities actually have proven exploits, whether POC, whether we know they're being used by threat actors in the wild. Another valuable resource, obviously, is CISA-KEV. CISA makes available a list of vulnerabilities that are being exploited in the wild by threat actors based on their intelligence, based on their conversations with other actors in the industry. And another thing that we can use, which is sort of like complementary to CVSS, is EPSS, which for those not familiar, basically gives an estimate of how likely a given vulnerability is to be exploited eventually. It's a theoretical data point. It doesn't have anything to do with proven in the wild information, but it's also something we can use if we don't have information about an exploit or on CISA-KEV. And the next thing we can do is look at high-value technologies. So get rid of all the vulnerabilities that are running in stuff that just doesn't run in the cloud. And finally, we do more advanced techniques like checking for using code analysis to check if, for example, if we're looking at a vulnerability in a dependency, is it actually running? Is the function actually loaded? Are the configuration required for exploitation actually met by the specific workload we're looking at? And is the affected tech actually running? And the last thing we want to do, because again, we're focusing on network vulnerabilities, is look at whether the vulnerable workload is actually exposed to the internet. We don't want to, we can afford to focus less on vulnerabilities and workloads that are behind a VPN or internal workloads. And just to give you an example of that, what we did is we looked back at what we call legacy vulnerabilities, as in stuff that's like going back to 2014, stuff like Eternal Blue, stuff like Dirty Cow, Heartbleed, Shellshock, and we tried to see how prevalent these are in cloud environments. And surprisingly, they are still very prevalent. For example, like 60% still have Print Nightmare, 30% still have Dirty Cow. We still see Dirty Cow being used in attacks on some cloud environments, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, like it's an ancient vulnerability. But once you look at public exposure, the numbers kind of drop dramatically. So like Dirty Cow goes from 30% to 10%. Print Nightmare goes down to 0 once you take into consideration whether the workload is actually a DC, for example. So this is very, very effective in reducing the numbers of vulnerabilities we have to focus on as well. So for the next slides, we built a different type of graph. We checked percent of cloud environments on one side, severity on the other, and we're using EPSS just to give you an idea of how concerned we should be about each vulnerability on the graph. So we took 5,000 vulnerabilities, most prevalent vulnerabilities in terms of number of environments we're seeing them at, and we put them on this graph. These are vulnerabilities from the past 3 years or so. And as you can see, there are a lot, but they're also very diverse in terms of how popular they are, in terms of how severe they are. The CVSS calculator is in charge of all the lines you can see here because they tend to sort of put all the vulnerabilities in one place, which makes severities kind of homogeneous, which is a bit unfortunate because if everything is critical, then nothing is. Then we begin to apply our filters. So first, we use the initial access filter I told you about before. We make sure that we get rid of anything that requires user interaction, anything that might require privileges. That gets rid of a bunch of stuff. The next thing we can do is check what is likely to be exploitable. So anything with a low EPSS percentile, anything that doesn't have a known exploit, or anything not on CISA-KEV's list. That gets rid of a bunch of more vulnerabilities. And the last thing we can do is apply a prevalence filter to focus on stuff that exists in more than 20% of cloud environments. So obviously, if something exists in your cloud environment, it is of concern. But since this is a research talk, and since we want to focus on the big picture, we want to see what is likely to exist in the vast majority of cloud environments. So once we apply all these filters, we're left with a relatively minuscule number of about 180 out of 3,000, which is about 3%. Obviously, again, our biases, again, this relies on how factual our data is. If CVSS can't be relied upon, then all the filters we applied become a bit less useful. So obviously we need our data to be good here. And CISA-KEV is very, very useful in the fact that it sort of ignores everything else. If something's on CISA-KEV, we're going to take it into consideration. So our next step here would be to prioritize based on tech value. So we could look at stuff that is more likely to exist in, more likely to have sensitive data, for example. If something exists in the cloud but doesn't really interest attackers, then we can also kind of safely ignore it if we want to. So let's talk about what we can actually learn about this, again, looking at the big picture. And also it's worth noting that since this is from our data, this is everything that cloud customers are choosing to ignore. So this is after, we as a CNAP already alerted to them to the existence of these vulnerabilities, and they decided consciously to prioritize other things. So we're guessing that a lot of these vulnerabilities are either overhyped, and our customers have decided as such, or perhaps they're underhyped. Perhaps they haven't been given enough attention in the media. So when we look at the winners of the tournament we just ran here, not surprisingly, the most prevalent stuff is in libraries, specifically in OpenSSL and XPath, which is an XML parser. A quarter of the top 100 vulnerabilities are also in libraries, and our data shows that nearly 80% of environments have at least a few VMs with critical library vulnerabilities on them. But obviously, with library vulnerabilities, it really depends. It depends if they're actually being used in a way that can be exploitable. So a lot of these vulnerabilities, depending on the situation, can also be safely ignored, unless there's something very, very special like Log4Shell, for example. And also, a lot of applications bring along their own libraries. So in many cases, you'll find a few of these instances on the same machine. One of them will be vulnerable, another one won't be. And it's kind of hard to tell which one is actually being used by the application unless you use runtime checks as well. In terms of the technologies, here we can see the technologies associated with those top 100 vulnerabilities. Two things interesting to note here. One, there are really a lot of CVEs in Windows Server that exist in a lot of cloud environments. We're guessing this might be a good thing, just because Microsoft is pretty transparent in terms of giving CVEs to a lot of things. They often assign tons of CVEs to the same patch just to make sure that they're covering every single particularity of a given attack. And also because Microsoft products are sort of a monoculture, so a lot of security researchers and a lot of threat actors are putting effort into finding these vulnerabilities in the first place. Whereas Linux is a lot more, there are a lot of variations in the kind of technologies you'll find there. Another thing is that there's still a lot of Log4Shell out there. And I think this sort of fits with what the Cybersecurity Review Board said in their report about a year ago, that Log4Shell is expected to be endemic in the cloud, and our data certainly seems to support this. Another thing we tried to do to sort of test this theory on ourselves, so part of our job is to surface what we identify as high-profile vulnerabilities to our customers and say, this is the stuff you should be focusing on. So this is a list of all the high-profile vulnerabilities since Log4Shell, and there have been quite a few. And we sort of wanted to check how on the mark we were in terms of how important these actually are in cloud environments. So what we did is we checked how prevalent they were when they were released, as opposed to how prevalent they are now. And it's interesting to see that we have a group of vulnerabilities at the top that were very, very prevalent, and I think we were justified in telling our customers, this is the stuff you need to focus on. Like, the internet was right about these, in terms of cloud at least. But on the bottom, we have a bunch of vulnerabilities in software that, kind of going back to what Merav mentioned earlier, are in the sort of on-prem versions of stuff that in the cloud, most cloud customers are using the SaaS versions. So you have Confluence, you have Atlassian stuff, you have GitHub, you have Outlook, stuff that cloud customers are typically not installing, they're just using the SaaS versions instead. So a lot of these vulnerabilities, we told our customers, this is the stuff you should be focusing on, and maybe we were wrong. Maybe we should have been focusing on other stuff as well. So let's talk about, in summary, about how we can improve at this process. One, obviously it would help if we had more public sources of vulnerability intelligence of higher quality, more information about who is trying to exploit what and where, what kind of threat actors are actually focusing on the cloud as opposed to other types of environment, better information for under what conditions each vulnerability can be exploited, which is something very, very difficult to understand from just dry CVSS data. Another thing we want to do, and this is sort of looking at ideas for maybe our next talk at our next conference, is try to cross-reference the theoretical data and the real-world data. So we have CVSS on one side, EPSS on one side. On the other side, we have our own data, other vendors' data. We have CISA-KEV. And another idea we thought we might be able to use is gray noise. They, for those not familiar, operate a very large network of honeypots. And at any given moment in time, they can see which vulnerabilities attackers are scanning for at a very, very worldwide scale. And it would be interesting to take vulnerabilities that perhaps didn't get a lot of hype, but are being scanned for, and try to focus on those. And another thing we thought we might be able to do is, since AI is all the rage, maybe we could put AI to work on trying to look at CVEs, see which CVEs are associated, for example, in very large changes in a product's code base, but didn't get much attention. Because very, very large changes are probably associated with a lot of work behind the scenes. That probably means that perhaps this is a significant vulnerability. And finally, one more thing we can do is use hype itself as a parameter. So something with very high severity, very high exploitability, very high prevalence in cloud environment, but for some reason nobody's talking about, maybe that's something we should put effort into understanding as well. And one tool we might be able to use for that is Feedly, for example, that they monitor talk on the internet. So in conclusion, I think some of our takeaways for today, if you didn't listen at all to anything we spoke about, which is fine, is that cloud creates sort of a different set of physics for vulnerability impacts. You should prioritize, or at least that's our suggestion, vulnerabilities with high initial access potential, as we defined it here, and high tech value in general and in your environment in particular. Using a lot of filters together is a lot stronger and a lot better than using a single filter. So like CVSS along with EPSS, along with CSAKEV, that's like the magic formula. And we also think we have a lot of room to grow here, like we spoke about, and that's what we're going to be doing in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitai and Merav. I'd like to see who has our first question. So we have about 5 to 7 minutes for questions. Feel free to raise your hand. I know we have a channel in Slack as well. Right. Well, I'll kick off a question. So there were several filters that you mentioned, to prioritize some of the vulnerabilities. What if you were to layer back on those filters? What would you start with?
In terms of trying to be a bit more conservative? Sorry. Like trying to be a bit more conservative? Being
conservative, and say maybe you've gotten an A+, you've gone through all of that high category. Mm-hmm. What's next?
Oh, like another filter we could apply?
Yes.
So I think what we didn't show here is, I think it would be interesting to create a repository, just idea throwing out there, of what sort of technologies are more dangerous to attack in the cloud. So I think that would be the next filter we might apply.
Yeah. And how would you go about that one?
Probably a lot of manual work. I think we would start with looking at real attacks and try to see what target attackers went after. For example, one thing we didn't get to here was checking how many of the vulnerabilities that Lapsus Group targeted, I think about a year ago, are still prevalent in cloud environments. Yeah. And so to try to prioritize those a bit higher. We could do the same for Team TNT in terms of Kubernetes and Docker and stuff. That would be the idea.
Thank you. Questions? Oh.
Hi, have you tried categorizing vulnerabilities that could be self-healed in terms of having some sort of automation to patch them? Because this is a conversation that's been going on for a while, and usually it's good in theory, and when we want to implement, we face on ground a lot of heat, that you cannot self-heal. What if you cause a disruption? So what is the percentage of it? Thank you.
So there are a few things to consider here. One, I think we mentioned this at the very beginning. There are a few areas that are still sort of black holes in terms of both detection and remediation. So appliances are a big issue there. One thing we can do is prioritize stuff that actually has a fix, as opposed to vulnerabilities that don't have a fix. And yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at technologies in terms of giving vendors a score on how good they are at keeping things updated and how fast, which is another sort of database that we might be able to use. And then perhaps we could try to prioritize vulnerabilities that are more likely to remain vulnerable for a while. But I think, again, in cloud environments, it really helps to shift to SaaS and serverless, just because a lot of the work there for automation of patching, just you outsource it to the vendor or to the cloud service provider. So I think try to do that wherever possible.
Other questions?
Hi, you mentioned that servers don't click on things and libraries get used a lot. Have you thought about applying, I guess, another filter for libraries that are more common in these technologies that you were talking about? And I suppose I'm also curious about how you could maybe get some data from smaller companies, because it sounds like you have a bias for large companies.
So you mean like trying to make a list of libraries that are more likely to be included in the high value technologies? Yeah. So I think it would be, I think SBOM might be a good tool for that going forward, because there's going to be, like there already is, and there's going to be a lot of data about what libraries are included in technologies. So we could take our list of most prevalent technologies and run like an SBOM on them, and then treat the libraries that are included in them as like give them a higher score as well. So that might be the next thing we're going to do. We are starting to, like in our own team, work on SBOM a bit more, but we haven't been giving it enough attention up until now, and we're probably going to start. Sorry, what was the second question?
How can you overcome like the bias? Sorry.
Right.
How can you overcome the bias for the larger companies that you have as clients?
So I think that would require more cooperation, like as a community, to try to figure out what everyone is seeing. So like this presentation is now public. So like this is our, like, I don't want to say gift to the world, but this is like, you know, we're making our this data public. I think it would be interesting to collaborate with other companies that are doing the same and try to see like the differences, because I think we will probably learn a lot from the differences between each company's data set.
All right, thank you again. If you guys want to connect with Merav and Amitai, you can see it on the screen here. About 2 minutes to our next session. Thank you.